this is a presidential election without a real opposition. And yet, we have seen a huge number of voters at the polls yesterday. So officially, more than 16 million people, over 80% of the Uzbek voters have turned out yesterday. What does that say about Uzbekistan?
Well, it's an important election for the country, and I think that there's a history here of high turnout for presidential elections, irrespective of the number of candidates on the ballot. I think it's seen in many ways as a duty or obligation to go and participate. And
do you look at those numbers as accurate?
So, I mean, we were in over 30 polling stations, so that's not necessarily,
30.
Yeah, with two teams. It's not necessarily a representative sample. I would say we did see a high turnout. It depends, I think, on certain factors, on what region you're in, but in large part, I would say that number was generally accurate. But we saw the steady progression of voters throughout the day, and we asked in every polling station we visited what their numbers were, and they had steadily increased more or less consistently.
When I asked voters yesterday and before the elections about whether they saw the lack of opposition as a problem, a lot of them surprisingly said no. They basically don't know what kind of a difference an opposition party make. And some even ask, what difference would they make? Would they solve my problems? Do opposition parties solve problems? And some even point to the history of Uzbekistan never having an opposition party. So for them, as much as outsiders and non-governmental groups and of course opposition activists talk about this, they don't really see that as a factor in the elections. Are there any examples around the world where you see similarities? How can Uzbekistan overcome this issue of having elections without opposition groups? Because it's always criticized for that, right? No matter what elections they have, whether it's parliamentary or presidential, OCE reports basically point to that there is no competition, there is no choice.
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think there needs to be the political will to allow other voices, including dissenting voices, to be heard. It actually adds greater credibility to the building of a democratic culture, and I think that's what it gets down to is democratic culture. For 30 plus years of independence in this country, the democratic political and democratic electoral culture is still not robust. It is not developed. When you have a system in which there is genuine opposition that does compete and has a certain segment of support, it strengthens the entire system. There needs to be a consideration of perhaps going forward how Parliament is structured. At this point, it's single mandate majoritarian, and there are 5, as you know, political parties that are allowed to compete. None of those are what we could call opposed to the current president. Now, on the other hand, there may be a generational change at work, and maybe there will be reform within the parties themselves, elements of which could be considered, views of which could be considered opposite to what the current administration wants. There are other extremes, we know, in the region where you do have really a polarized political environment, such as Georgia. And many point to the opposition there as being dysfunctional, etc., or the government itself is in that manner. You have to have an environment where people actually are educated and motivated to understand the difference between what is opposition, what is not, and that it's okay, and in the mind of people in government, to have a diverse political environment. But it all gets back down to building the expectation and building the understanding that democracy involves viewpoints and people and stakeholders from across the gamut. We're told it's going to take time here. I think the environment, I'm hopeful the environment is conducive to a continuing development of that democratic political culture.
So you've spent some time here, a decent amount of time, to see changes, to be able to analyze. You've traveled, I believe, around the country. You've talked to many people. Do you see any signs or any clear signs of the beginning of that process, like the learning curve of Uzbekistan? Trying to taste the democracy, basically?
I think you see it every day when you speak to young people, and one of the big reasons is the access to information now. The use of social media and different informational channels in this country is exploding, and I think when you have kind of, and that goes hand in hand with the greater degree of relative greater degree of openness in the country, but there is a building expectation now where I think people feel less restrained perhaps than before, and there are certain realities still that are present in the country, but I think the expectation and the greater exposure to sources of information and news from outside the country perhaps is reinforcing this idea that we can do more and we want to do more. And if you look at as you know well, and we want more. Yeah.
It was very interesting to hear actually something that I had never heard before, covering elections, covering the political environment here. People are now openly saying that we deserve more, we deserve better, we deserve the better presidential campaign, we deserve better engagement. I wish candidates came to us asking for our vote.
Exactly.
I wish, and some even said that we wish that president asked for our vote. For some citizens, for them, they feel like their votes are taken for granted.
Yeah, it's a fairly novel idea to have people actually compete for your vote in Uzbekistan. And I think part of it is the political parties that exist, and hopefully parties that may be registered need to develop platforms and sell them to the population. And there are honest debates among the parties in parliament on different issues that happen.
Right. Yeah. And
but
that's seen as a change too.
It's seen as a change, but often on these campaigns, you don't see or hear from candidates or parties until there's an election time. And that's not only the case in Uzbekistan, but there needs to be a greater consistency in the part of political actors to engage with citizens, which is going forward at whatever level, local level or national level. And ideally, you'll have a more diverse political spectrum that will result. But it's really twofold. It's the ability of those actors to communicate using means that are popular with people, and for people to be interested in consistently demanding information and attention from those political actors.
Mm-hmm. Your organization, International Foundation for Electoral Systems, you work around the world to improve these systems. How can you help Uzbekistan? What are you doing now with Uzbekistan in terms of reforming its electoral system to improve it?
Well, IFES is here under funding provided by the United States Agency for International Development and the U.S. Department of State to help with Uzbekistan's continuing democratic development, organic development, providing targeted assistance to help the country develop a flourishing democracy. I see there being assistance needed certainly in certain areas of professional electoral management, so on the technical side, but also very much on the development of civic organizations and citizen education. I think this goes hand in hand in terms of the so-called supply side and demand side. I see hope for progress in that, and we know the Election Commission has worked ardently to create democratic election reform, and there needs to be corresponding interest among other groups in society to serve in a capacity of monitoring the political process. And we're hopeful that civil society organizations can be registered, that are independent, that will be able to serve that function, because it is a symbiotic relationship between the civil side and the government side. But the number one objective is to serve the voters, to serve the citizens. So I would say that I hope as a result of what we've seen here, there will be increased energy for the democratic process as part of the next state development strategy, and that civic society and civil society organizations are going to be further prioritized for positive attention going forward.